You're listening to The Observing Eye. Pirate radio for the mind. Coming at you fresh from the computer hell cabin.
Hello, you beautiful lot. It's Friday, the 12th of January, 2024, and you are listening to episode 47 of The Observing Eye, coming at you live from the computer hell cabin. As always, I like to begin these episodes with a brief moment of reflection. So, let's spend a moment considering the good things that have happened this week. And now a moment for the not so good. If you followed along from our episode last week, you'll know that this January I am putting together 4 episodes to try and support you in your growth and personal development. As we all know, it's, that time of resolution and change and contemplation in January. New year comes in, new year, new you. That's a kind of ethos, isn't it? So today I am going to be talking about the power of critical thinking and how impactful that methodology, that mode of thinking can be in your life. Critical thinking then is a mental process that enables us to actively analyze, evaluate, and synthesize information and ideas that come at us. And in doing this, it supports us to be able to make reasoned and well-informed decisions. So at its core, critical thinking means that we aren't just accepting stuff that's thrown at us at face value. It's all around asking questions, looking at the evidence, and thinking for yourself. The wonderful thing about critical thinking is that we all have the capacity to do it. And I guarantee that there will have been times in your past, some more than others, depending upon whom you are, where you will have engaged in critical thinking before. Anything that involves you looking at information, assessing what's going on, and coming to your own conclusions is part of critical thinking. We're taking the emotion out of the equation, we're losing the irrational, and we're stepping back to observe what is in front of us rather than the perception of what is in front of us. And that's a really important distinction. There's this wonderful idea, and I think it was Jim Carrey who said it, where he talks about the eyes being projectors as much as they are cameras. So we absorb in reality, it comes into our senses, and then it gets sort of mushed around with our experiences and our prejudices and our biases and all of that stuff that's going on beneath the surface. And our actual reality is a projection back out into the world of this amalgam of what is going on factually in front of us and the overlay of our perceptions on top of that. Now, critical thinking, the idea behind critical thinking is to minimize our own biases and beliefs that we put on top of what's happening in order to enable us to make a reasoned and informed decision or to come to an informed understanding that is absent of those emotional ties. There are 3 core components that make up critical thinking, and I'm going to walk through what they are, and then we're going to dive into why critical thinking is important from the context of working on ourselves and how we can use it as a tool to examine our own self-awareness and our own prejudices and biases and all of the other gumph that's going on. So we start with analysis. We all know what that means. We take a complex thing, a complex idea, a complex situation. We try and break it down into bite-sized chunks that we can digest intellectually. We examine those components. We examine the fact of what's going on inside the context of the thing that we're examining. And then we identify any assumptions that we may be bringing with us. So these assumptions are the things that we want to try and remove. And we're removing them because an assumption comes from past experience. What we want to do with critical thinking is objectively observe. We don't want to allow or bring into effect anything that's going to skew the fact of the thing that we are analyzing, the object of our observation. So step one, analysis. Then we begin evaluation. So once we've dissected the information, critical thinking compels us to evaluate it and to apply rigor to that evaluation. This next step is the art of discerning the quality and the reliability of sources, weighing the strength of evidence, identifying logical fallacies or biases that may lurk within our arguments. Once we've finished our evaluation, we move on to the final step, which is to synthesize. Now, this means that we start to connect the dots. We take all of this information that we've gathered and the ideas that we've come up with ourselves, and we weave them together to create this comprehensive and well-rounded perspective that is based on reason and not emotion. I just want to be very clear at this point that there is absolutely nothing wrong with emotion, and there is nothing wrong with being emotional. The reason that we want to try and remove it from critical thinking is because emotion clouds the waters, and we want to be able to observe and understand something with a certain level of clarity. If we bring emotion into that, what comes with the emotion is a lot of those perceptions and internal biases that can skew the outcome of our assessment and interrupt our thinking. That's the idea of critical thinking then, in a nutshell. You may be thinking, well, what's the point? Why do I need to know this? Why do I need to apply it to my life? And how can it be useful? On the surface, we can sort of see critical thinking perhaps as the area for engineers or lawyers or scientists and people who have a role where they are having to analyze information and be very pragmatic with the way that they observe that information. However, critical thinking is not just a cognitive exercise. In my view, it is a cornerstone of responsible and informed decision making. And I'm going to explain a bit about why I think that. At its very core, critical thinking empowers us. It gives us the tools and the methodology to be able to navigate a world that is overflowing with information, with opinions, and with complexity. Through critical thinking, we gain a sense of agency over our thoughts and agency over our actions, which in turn allows us to engage more effectively with the world in a deliberate and informed manner. It encourages us to ask questions, to dig deeper, and to challenge our assumptions. Critical thinking nurtures our curiosity. It motivates us to seek knowledge, to gain understanding. When we are able to properly analyze, evaluate, and synthesize information, we become active participants in our own journey of self-development and discovery. It encourages us to examine situations from numerous different angles and perspectives. It prompts us to stop and consider the implications of our choices, and it helps us to anticipate the potential outcomes of those choices in a world where responsible decision-making is paramount. And its impact isn't just limited to the individual. Society as a whole benefits hugely when its members are able to engage in critical thinking. It fosters a culture of intellectual engagement, of dialogue, and of progress. People become more open to diverse ideas, more tolerant, more accepting. And this is why I stress the importance of critical thinking. I was thinking at this point that I could dive into some of the history and where critical thinking comes from. I'm going to skim over it a little bit, but I'm going to give you some pointers and some signposts for where you can go and find out more information if you are so inclined. Fortunately, I can intertwine it with an example of critical thinking. We're going to go back to Socrates, the great toga-wearing wizard of ancient Greece. He came up with this mode of questioning, which is unironically called Socratic questioning. And it's something that we use in therapy as a therapist when working with clients in order to cut through the noise and to get to the root of what's going on with them. what's going on with their reality. So in Socratic questioning, and this is a perfect example of critical thinking. So in Socratic questioning, let's say I have a client and they're sitting opposite me and they're saying, I'm having a really shit time at work. Everybody hates me. So engaging my Socratic questioning, I would ask, okay, I'm sorry to hear that. That's my therapist bit. I'm sorry to hear that. Can you give me some examples of what's going on in the workplace? And the client says, we're going to call our antagonist Jim in this one. No offense, Jim. So the antagonist, the client says, this guy Jim was a massive arsehole to me. He berated me in front of everybody and made me feel really small and inferior. And I went and I wept quietly in my car at lunchtime whilst eating my sandwich that had become soggy through my tears. Then I, as a therapist, say, well, I'm sad to hear that you had a bad sandwich experience. Perhaps you can give me some more examples of how people are treating you poorly at work. And then the client retorts with, the cleaning person had a bit of a moan at me because I left a couple of dirty coffee mugs in the sink and they were a week old and crusty and had little mold and anthrax things growing in them. To which I reply, well, I can understand the cleaner being a little bit irked by that. You are an adult and you should clean up after yourselves, really. But getting back to people hating you at work, what other examples can you give me of people behaving poorly to you? And the client sits there and they sort of think about it for a bit, they mull it over, and they can't give me any other examples of how people are treating them poorly in the workplace. So bear in mind, they've come to the therapist and they've said that everybody hates them at work. Everybody. That's their perception. Through the use of Socratic questioning, we've identified that they've had a really bad experience with this guy called Jim. He's been a bit of an arse, and a little bit of a pulling up by the cleaning person, which is probably justified, really, given the context. So the reality of the situation is that Jim's been a massive arsehole and shouldn't pull them up in front of everybody. And if we dive deeper into the story, Jim's probably going through his own stuff and suffering as well, and he's just projecting that out into everybody else. It's not necessarily aimed at the client as an individual. It's just Jim having a really bad day and behaving poorly. The cleaner, yeah, okay, we can sort of agree with that one being pulled up. But again, it's not everybody hates them. It's a bad incident with one person and it's a mild something with another. Their perception does not match the reality. What we're presented with is everybody hates me. And when we dig deeper, when we look for more evidence, when we analyze and we evaluate, we can come to the conclusion that that presentation is false. This is what critical thinking enables us to do. And that was a very simplified version, but I think you can get the gist off the back of that example. I guess for the final section of the podcast, like you'll see sitting there going, well, yeah, it's nice to know what critical thinking is. And I've got a wonderful little example there of someone who left a crappy mug in a sink. But how do I actually apply it? How do I make it work? How do I get better at it? Let's have a go. As always with this stuff, there is no simple answer. There is no easy road. But I will walk through a couple of things that may help and point you in the right direction. Now, we were talking earlier about how our own assumptions, our own prejudices can impact our ability to think critically about something. So that's the first thing, being able to understand what our own drivers, biases, and motivators are and how they can impact our perception. Fundamentally, we need to examine the underlying beliefs that inform our opinions and decisions. So we need to ask ourselves, why do I think this is true and what evidence supports this belief? Whenever something comes up and they just, these thoughts and feelings, they just bubble up out of nowhere from under the surface. When they come up, it's about catching them and asking ourselves that question. Why is this true? What supports this belief? If there isn't an answer to that question, generally, it's like a poor assumption and it's come from somewhere external, or it's come from a bad experience that you've had that's influencing how you think about something that's in a similar context. There's that saying in finance, isn't there? Past performance doesn't predict future success or something. Well, unfortunately, the brain works in exactly the opposite way. It likes to follow the same path. And if it's experienced something before and it gets put in a similar sort of situation again, or a situation that it infers to be similar, then the brain goes, I've been through this before. I didn't like it last time and I don't like it now. It's like a reflex thing. So we need to be aware of that. And that takes practice. That's all I can say. That takes practice and effort and working on self-awareness. So I guess step one is get more self-aware if you aren't more self-aware, which is really broad and unhelpful and vague. But I'm trying to keep this podcast short. So maybe I'll do an episode on working on cultivating self-awareness, shall we say, in a few weeks' time to try and help support that if people find that useful. So that's my first bit of completely unhelpful advice. Just go and get more self-aware. Something that's going to be really useful for you to help foster critical thinking, and I promise this will be more useful than just go and get more self-aware, is to engage a bit more in something called active listening. So if you've not come across this before, I'm pulling in some of my therapy techniques into this. So active listening is basically a means of evaluating and understanding another person's viewpoint. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this. I've noticed this, but I'm a big introvert and I tend to watch people talk rather than engage in talk myself. Not from the bushes, like actually in the group with the people. I just stare at them from across the street, like hiding behind the bins. Watching people talk. A lot of the time, a conversation is transactional in the sense of one person talks, and whilst that one person is talking, the other person is waiting for their moment to speak and not necessarily taking in what the first person is saying. So active listening is kind of the opposite of this. We are genuinely engaged and listening, not just for the sake of responding, but to properly comprehend and enable us to reflect on what is being said. So we are engaging with another person's ideas in a very thoughtful and open and non-judgmental way. How is this helpful? Well, critical thinking relies on us being able to understand the full context of what's going on and to be able to have empathy and view things from multiple different angles. The best way to be able to view things from different angles is to understand those angles. And people have all sorts of different angles of viewing things. So by genuinely listening to another person's thoughts and ideas, which especially if they're different to your own, this is going to lead me on to my next bit. If they're different to your own, then it enables you to just get a bit of a different perspective on things. It's very similar to like if you go and read a book that's written by someone that has very diverse ideas to you, and you get the background and the context of why they think that, if it's written reasonably well, you'll get to understand the reasoning behind it. And we have to remember that it's very easy to feel like everybody thinks like us, but nobody thinks like us. It's just that the way we think is the only way that we know how to think, so we presume everybody else does it the same way. So you want to get out there and expose yourself and listen. Not expose yourself. No, you get on the list. Don't expose yourself. Expose yourself to multiple different sources of perspective and soak it up and genuinely listen and engage and ask them questions. Dive deeper. Use that Socratic questioning. Open-ended questions, not closed questions. So an open-ended question is one that will require more than a yes or no answer. You are asking a question that leads the person to explain and explore something that they've previously said. So those are great to get people to open up. And generally, people like talking about themselves. So it's great. You'll be reveling in it. You'll be getting loads of information that you can use to support your critical thinking. What else can I give you on this? Embracing complexity, I think, is a good one. So don't be frightened of things that are complex. Don't try and oversimplify something because it appears to be complicated. There are nuances in things, and nuances are important. It's the nuances that can change the context of something. So don't just boil everything down to its most basic parts. When you're presented with something, a problem that you need to think about, it's important to take every aspect of it and to, as we talked about in the beginning, not alluded to, I genuinely said it. There was no alluding. I spaketh it, that we should break things down into smaller components, but that doesn't mean to simplify. We break them down into smaller components so that we can properly examine and understand them in detail. And it's the detail that's key. Critical thinking isn't about just washing over stuff with simplicity. It's about getting into the complexity and understanding stuff. So that's really important, to not be afraid of complexity. Don't oversimplify things. Be comfortable with the idea that some questions are going to be tough. Sometimes there isn't going to be an easy answer, and it's going to really push you. And, that's part of the fun of critical thinking, I find, is to challenge the mind a bit, and it becomes more of an exercise. How far can you push yourself to understand it? Challenge yourself, get out of your comfort zone a little bit with that. So don't be frightened of complexity. And one last thing that you shouldn't be frightened of either: mistakes. Don't worry about making mistakes. You can analyze and evaluate and come to a conclusion, and it could be totally wrong. And that's absolutely fine, because you're learning, and we're all learning. And that's exactly, I still make mistakes like that. I am not some ethereal enlightened being. I'm just as human as everybody else. And, sometimes I join the dots in the wrong way, and instead of a giraffe, I've drawn a camel, and everyone's really confused. And that happens. You've got the important thing with mistakes, and I'm sure I've said this previously, I'll be surprised if I haven't. The important thing with mistakes is not to see them as failure. Mistakes are they are moments from which we can learn more about ourselves if we apply some reflection. And that's all it is. Look at the mistake, and instead of getting all angry with yourself and frustrated about making it, just look at it and go, okay, so what went wrong? What did I do that I can change? What lessons can I learn from this? And then you'll start to enjoy mistakes. Making a mistake isn't a fault in yourself. It's a natural part of learning. So embrace those mistakes and learn from them, and think about how you can adapt and change your thinking going forwards when it comes to this stuff. And as we come towards the end of the episode, let's just quickly paraphrase and go over some of the things that we've discussed in order to try and help you improve your critical thinking. So firstly, we've got, just magically become self-aware. But I know that pretty much all of you listening to this will have some understanding, if not much more, of practices and things you can do to improve your self-awareness, self-reflection, journaling, all of that kind of stuff, meditating, anything that works for you. Going to therapy, great way of improving your self-awareness. We've got asking questions. Asking questions are great. Best way to find something out is to ask a question. Active listening, so genuinely listening and engaging with what someone is saying to you and soaking it up, learning different perspectives and viewpoints, and especially those that are different from your own. We've got don't forgo complexity. Simplicity isn't always key. The nuances and the detail are important, and we want to make sure that we take time to observe those. And finally, get comfortable making mistakes. Because there's nothing wrong with making a mistake. It's just that people tell us that it's wrong. But it's not really. It's absolutely fine. It's natural. That's how we learn. So keep doing it. Keep making mistakes. Make all the mistakes. Become the mistaker. And on that note, that is all I have to say on the subject of critical thinking. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to each and every one of you who have taken your time out to listen to this today. I hope there's been some content in here that's proven useful, that you can take away, that you can apply to your own practices, your own self-development work, and what have you. I'd also, as always, really keen to hear what you've got to say about anything. Now, if you go onto the many social platforms upon which we exist, I'm doing that we again. I'm doing that thing, not we, I'm not literally weeing. I'm not weeing. I'm weeing verbally, not physically. That thing where I use the word we instead of I. It's just me in the house again and the cat. The cat's done nothing but sleep and shit this morning. Absolutely zero contribution to this whatsoever. Let me start that again. If there's anything that you'd like to comment on, including some of the pointless rhetoric that I include in the epilogue of each episode, you can come along to our many social platforms. The home of the podcast is Substack, and we have a new domain name. It is now just theobservingeye.com, which reminds me that I need to change the outro, so you're going to have to stick with the old one for this week, and I'll change it next week. Theobservingeye.com, that's our Substack. That's where everything lives. The written work, the podcast, all of it. If you're into other social platforms, you can find us on YouTube at The Observing Eye, on TikTok at The Observing Eye, and on Instagram at The Observing Eye. Any of those platforms of your choice, throw a comment in there and I will respond as soon as humanly possible. I try and respond to each and every one of you who puts a message in. And by message, I mean meaningful message. Do not send me pictures of aubergines. I do not respond to pictures of aubergines. As it's Friday, I'd like to wish you all a good weekend. I know January can be a bit of a mixed bag sometimes. Sometimes it can be motivating and energizing and we're moving forwards, and sometimes it can be a real doldrum. So I hope that you are the former and not the latter. And if you are finding yourself in the doldrum, just remember self-compassion, self-compassion, self-compassion. Much love, everybody, and I'll catch you soon.
You've been listening to The Observing Eye. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope that you found it useful. And if you're interested in any more of my writings or work around psychology and philosophy and general day-to-day living, please go and take a look at my Substack, which is theobservingeye.substack.com, and that's I as in the letter, not I as in the gelatinous organ through which you see. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll see you soon.